Hello and a very warm welcome to the brand new edition of Policy Watch. I'm Kriti Mishra. Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change has released Draft National Resource Efficiency Policy. The policy envisions a future with environmentally sustainable and equitable economic growth, resource security, healthy environment and restored ecosystems with rich ecology and biodiversity. The Draft National Resource Efficiency Policy is guided by the principles of reduction in primary resource consumption to sustainable levels, creation of higher value with less material through resource-efficient and circular approaches, waste minimization and creation of employment opportunities and business models beneficial to the cause of environment protection and restoration. And to get deeper insights on the topic, I'm joined by Mr. Souvik Bhattacharjya, Fellow, Center for Resource Efficiency and Governance, TERI, Dr. Shymali Singh, Assistant Professor, Center for Environment and Climate Change, Indian Institute of Public Administration, and Mr. Yatish, Rajawat, Senior Journalist. Welcome to Raj Sabha Television, all of you. Sir, let me come to you first. Take us through the important highlights of the Draft National Resource Efficiency Policy.
Thank you so much, and it's really a privilege to be a panelist in the Rajya Sabha TV. And I would like to also congratulate Rajya Sabha TV for taking up this particular topic for discussion. And it's extremely important, particularly at a time when the economy is passing through a different critical time. Now, if I have to give a kind of a background of this particular policy, I have to go back a couple of years ago when in the institute at TERI, we started working on this particular topic of improving resource utilization, because what's happening currently is that there are different policies and interventions across different line ministries, but what eventually is missing a kind of a linkage across these different policies. So one of the objective was to see that how these existing policies are currently working in place in terms of promoting resources, and how we can promote a kind of a life cycle thinking across the different stakeholders, so that it's not like stakeholders thinking in isolation, but resources which are being extracted, produced, fabricated, designed and ultimately being consumed is a kind of a one unit, one entity which is covering through, which is traveling through different stages of the life cycle. So it's that particular aspect which is very critical, and that's where we actually started taking up, but taking up all the sectors was not possible. So eventually what we did was we took up the automotive sector, and eventually we moved to the solar PV sector. We took up the electric vehicle sector and saw what are the opportunities that exist, and that led to a lot of interest coming up from different stakeholders. And one of the prime ministries that in fact came forward in terms of taking this idea, and we suggested this one to have a kind of a national resource efficiency policy at the national level. So that's where we in fact first compiled all the sectoral assessments that we had actually done and shared it with the Ministry of Environment and Forest, and that led to the formation of the draft of the National Resource Efficiency Policy.
Right, so that was the journey. Dr. Shymali, tell us how will this policy actually ensure the mainstreaming of resource efficiency in India?
If we look at the entire policy, which is yet in the draft stages, and if we look, as very rightly said by Souvik, that if you look at the sectoral analysis of the same, two major sectors of solar photovoltaics and plastic packaging have been taken up on a very, very large scale by the Prime Minister of India. A big no to the one-time use of plastic from 2nd of October, and with India entering into International Solar Alliance, which we had already signed and entered into in 2015 in relation to the intended nationally determined contributions. So if we talk about the mainstreaming of the policies, it will be very, very optimal to look into the fact that only one ministry, of course there has to be a ministry to coordinate the same, but one ministry alone will not be able to meet the desired results. It will be a wholesome process, a holistic approach of all ministries, because if when we are talking about resource efficiency, the end product of one industry would be used as the initial product of another. So there has to be an industrial symbiosis, and in that matter all the ministries would have to be on board, so as to see that there is a complete and a total outlook of the end product, and we would be using less of virgin material, and more stress would be on the secondary resource material, which would help us in treading towards the dreamed 24-25's $5 trillion US dollar economy.
You mentioned about second resource material. Let me take that to Mr. Rajawat. Sir, India's primary consumption increased 6 times from 1.18 billion tons in 1970 to approximately 17 billion tons in the year 2015. How would the government ensure that there's reduction in the primary consumption?
So, I mean, it is difficult to control primary consumption because you're looking at an economy which is targeting to grow at $5 trillion. What you can do is increase the efficiency of existing resources that you're consuming and recycle some of the resources, so that more efficient use of overall resource chain is maintained, and that is what this policy envisages. But you see, the challenge with any omnibus policy of this nature is that there are so many stakeholders in this. For instance, if you look at the extraction part, which is resources, you have the Ministry of Mining there, you have the Ministry of Oil there, you have, so within these two ministries there is conflict. And if you bring in a third ministry which says that we're going to set up a regulatory body here which will not only look at extraction but look at production, look at consumption, look at recycling and look at disposal. Now all these 5 areas of this life cycle of a product are managed by different parts of the government, and some of them are divided at central level and some of them exist at state or city level. Like for instance, disposal is a city level issue.
Yes.
Recycling does not exist as in anybody's area of domain of expertise or regulation. Production is everybody's domain because that is where all the companies lie. So, you know, the Ministry of Finance is involved, the CBDT is involved, because I mean the policy envisages some amount of taxation and some amount of incentives for nudging a behavior either on recycling or on secondary material reusage. So while the policy is drafted very well in the sense that both in its linguistic capability and its ability to crunch so many issues in so little space, but I foresee that one, there has to be a enormous amount of debate on this issue and discussion, so that this policy, like some of the other very well-meaning and well-wishing policies in the past, do not get hampered by inter-ministerially and inter-department conflicts, or even between the federal and the state. Because you see, landfill, for instance, which the policy talks about extensively, is something that is in the domain of the state. That's and it finally lands up as a regulatory issue with the city. Now when the centre starts saying that we will set up a regulatory body which will set up standards and policies and maybe even regulate that, there obviously is going to be conflict. So one of the, I think one of the steps that needs to be done with this policy is that it needs to be translated in multiple languages, one. Second, it needs to be communicated at state and city level, so that people, and this policy will only be successful if people start demanding that we need it. Because you see, the impact of this policy is very large. You know, we talk about pollution every winter, you know, we debate it, we discuss it. But and we say that, you know, we will stop the cars, we'll do odd and even, we'll do these micro band-aids kind of a solution. They never work. They will never work unless until, you know, the whole supply chain is addressed. And this is what this policy envisages to do. So somewhere this disconnect which exists in our polity or in our society needs to be broken down, and we need to understand that there is a resource change which is basically depleting our air quality, which is affecting our water supply, which is affecting even the soil, which we are not affected by because we live in cities. But if you talk to for the farmers in the rural area, they tell you that the quality of soil is deteriorating, or even there is surveys done which says that the topsoil is degenerating in India much faster than anywhere else. So these are big issues, and all of them need to occupy center stage and center debate, and that has to be done in multiple languages.
But you're making a very important point there about fixing the entire supply chain, and I'll take that to you, sir. The policy is drafted very well, as was mentioned by Mr. Rajawat. But how do we get all the stakeholders on board?
Right. That's indeed a challenge in terms of getting all the stakeholders on board, and the stakeholders in fact go beyond the ministries. So it's the private sector, the social sector, even the state governments, the local municipalities. The bandwidth in fact is so large that coming up with a kind of a framework to bring all the stakeholders on board in fact will be a kind of a humongous challenge. So one of the beautiful aspect of this particular policy has been to create a board wherein we have been able to see or bring in representatives from all the line ministries who are working for different sectors or various stages of the value chain of these different sectors, and it's their domain. It's not that the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change is going to enter into that particular domain. It's about a collaborative approach in terms of understanding what the challenges are and how we can actually bring in the principles of 6R across those different sectors, across different stages of the life cycle, and accordingly encourage the stakeholders to work in line with the larger objective of achieving the sustainable consumption and production, and which I see is one of the important goals of the sustainable development agenda for the world and India in particular, because the kind of growth in resources that we envisage in the next 10-15 years is huge. Where we are going to get those resources from? Because we are already import huge amount of oil.
Yes.
We are import dependent on so many critical resources. In fact, these resources will fuel some of the major sectors which are yet to come. Electric vehicles, photovoltaic and modern electronics would all require those typical materials. So I think it's important to have that level of awareness at the top level, which is actually at the ministerial level, and at the same time we can have or should have rather stakeholders coming from representatives coming from different stakeholder communities, and they need to contribute and understand what would be the limitations and work together in terms of overcoming those limitations and make this a reality and dream towards the $5 trillion economy. Yeah.
So we have to encourage all the stakeholders
Absolutely.
for achieving that target.
Absolutely.
But Dr. Shymali, talking about this particular draft, it also talks about the action plans with time frame of 3 financial years. Now the first draft or the first action plan to this effect is prepared from 2019 to 2022. What are the targets of this plan?
Basically, in this time frame of 3 years, they have, as he has already told, they have taken up, ministry has concentrated on 7 specific sectors, because it will be very difficult to take all the sectors in one go, as with the obvious reasons that we have an enormous, huge stakeholders, both from different ministries, from different states, they have a difference in the center and the state level. And I would like to add to him, it is not only the inter-ministry, it is the intra-ministerial problems also, because there are so many different divisions which are looking into it, and then there needs to be a single coordinating force for the same. But in the same breath, I would also like to add that though it is a very difficult and a daunting task, but it is the demand of the day that there has to be some agency, some industry, some ministry, to coordinate the same, to act as the role would be of the coordinator, though without entering into the territory. It should not pose as a threat, but definitely it should have strict rules and regimes so as to give a plan of action so that the other ministries can follow, and it can be used as a prototype in the other sectors which would be taken up after these 7 sectors, after these 3 years. Like for example, the 7 sectors which we have the automotive sector, we have the construction, real estate sector, we have the solar photovoltaic sector, electrical and electronics, then we have steel and aluminium. So these sectors are there, and if you look at these sectors, they contribute to almost 25% of the GDP, and they are the ones which are the priority areas which need to be taken care of. And there is a lot of scope in all these sectors which can be done, and by shunning the linear economy and adopting the circular economy, I think major achievements can be done, and we can save on our resources, and we can feed our teeming millions. Because another important point which I want to draw your attention to is that we've been talking about, only though in the plan it is very well mentioned in the draft plan, both the abiotic and the biotic resources, but we are not yet, we are not yet in full capacity. We are not able to deal with the abiotic components. What to talk of the poor flora and fauna? We are not at all touching about the biotic components, the biodiversity, the ecology. So maybe in the later phases we'll have to see on those facets too.
So monitoring is very important, and I take that point to you, sir. How do we monitor the implementation of these action plans?
So obviously, the first step here is that this policy needs to be communicated. Then, of course, this policy needs to be accepted and adopted. For it to be adopted, then we'll come to the action plans, later on. So if it is accepted, then you will have two basic bodies being set up and formed under it. One is the regulatory authority, and the other is the board. Now, it will be the responsibility of both the regulatory authority, and the regulatory authority will set up the rules and the regulation which will govern the sectors that it has identified, those 7 sectors it has identified. The board obviously will then create a consensus and of implementing those rules and regulation. Because this is a consensual process, it needs to also be linked to the larger game plan that the government has. And I believe that the Prime Minister has set up in his August 15th speech also, he set up a higher plan. He said that we need to, instead of focusing just on minutiae of ease of business, we need to focus on a higher goal, which is ease of living.
Yes.
Now, I believe that this environmental policy needs to be linked to ease of living, and once it is linked with ease of living, then we might be able to pull together different ministries into doing this. Because to convince, say for instance, to convince the finance ministry that you need to give incentives for secondary reusage of material, what is the rationale? Because they will obviously lose revenue receipt.
Yes.
And in the current scenario, they are very wary of losing any kind of revenue receipts.
Yes.
The only way they can be convinced about that is that it will raise the ease, it will improve the life of people, it will improve the living conditions, and it will finally have impact therefore on ease of doing business, because it will change the quality of life in our cities. So that is the argument which needs to be put together, and that argument needs to be presented for each of these ministries to be convinced that why are we asking for this life cycle monitoring, life cycle change of product. I mean, look at this, there is a scrappage policy,
Yes.
which the auto sector has been talking about, and the government has said that, and they've been insisting that the scrappage policy should basically say that instead of the vehicles being on the road for 20 years, there should be, off-roads in 15 years or 12 years.
Yes.
In line with that, now you have a vehicle which is going off-road, it needs to be scrapped. When it is scrapped, it will create waste. When the waste is created, there needs to be a policy for reusing it. But the auto sector is not interested in the reuse of the policy, reuse of that waste. And there is a lobby, which is the steel and the aluminium and the metal lobby, which is against of any reuse, unless
Yes.
until that reusage goes through them, or they control that scrap into their into their products. So, but this, and that is why these two things don't get linked, because there is a sector which says which stops at reusage, and there is another sector which says that we don't want to reusage because the price of our end product will be affected. In this, somebody has to step in and say that this is a better way of doing things for the country, and you need to let go of some commercial interest, which we will cover with incentives,
Right.
in case if you come and meet us halfway. Now that's a whole process, and for that you need both leadership at bureaucracy level, and you also need leadership at the political level, because a lot of this convincing will have to be done with multiple stakeholders. So I mean, it's a great policy, it's a wonderful policy, but the implementation of policy, as they say, lies in the details as it will be implemented, and that detail is basically consensus led.
And you also mentioned that the onus lies on the industry as well. Sir, let me understand from you, how do our businesses remain environmentally sustainable? How do we create such business models?
Well, I would say that the industry is already there on board. There are a lot of industries, in fact, are investing a lot of time and money seeing how these resources can actually find a second life. Say, for example, the steel industry. The conventional route of making steel is increasingly becoming more expensive because the domestic resources are getting depleted. It's increasingly becoming difficult to actually renew the existing licenses. The conventional approach also use a lot of coking coal, and
Yes.
India do not have enough coking coal, and we import a lot, and the import bill is rising. So few of the major players, they are already investing in terms of seeing how the secondary steel can be actually made more competitive in terms of its value addition, and it's also finding a market among the consumers. Then now the real challenge would be to create a scale, because all these products are being generated. I mean, the end of life products are actually very much scattered. So in fact, actually bringing that level of scale to ensure that the business is sustainable in terms of the economies of scale, it would be a challenge. But they are actually coming up with unique models to see that how the scale effects can be generated, and eventually what will happen is that they will be able to deliver these recycled product in a more economically effective manner, in a competitive manner, and also in line with the standards of the virgin materials. So I see there are a lot of initiatives which are taking place, but yes, there would be a lot of initiatives in the future depending on what kind of policy instruments we come up with. As Sir mentioned in terms of the role of the economic instruments, I think the real testing aspect would be how we make these incentives win-win opportunities for all the players in the market. And although it would be a kind of a testing time in the initial years, but eventually I feel that this is the only way it can create a market and opportunities for both the players who are in the virgin product manufacturing as well as in the recycled product manufacturing. And over time, the recycled product manufacturing business will thrive like anything, and it will actually in fact draw a lot of players from the virgin manufacturers to make or give that required scale effect to make the sustainable products.
To ensure win-win
more,
situation for all these stakeholders.
Yes, absolutely.
Dr. Shymali, I have last 60 seconds. The draft also talks about green procurement. Tell us more about green procurement.
Basically, green procurement is more with the consumer behavior. If as it was discussed, if we have more of incentives, so there has to be a change in the behavior of the consumer. Let's say in case if I have to build my house, of course I will not go for a construction and demolition waste which is recycled. So definitely there has to be a behavioral change in that, which will be done by the incentivization of the green procurement. If there should be a incentive on the part of the consumer, so that, and also there should be an assurance which can be through audits, through monitoring, through verification, that whatever product you are using, it is not a second grade quality, it is a first grade quality, and whatever house you are building or the plastic material you are using, it is not going to, I mean, your money will not go down the drain. So behavior, unless we do not tap on the behavior of the consumer, the scheme might not achieve that heights of success. This is my personal belief.
So creating awareness is also very
Exactly.
important. On that note, thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. So the draft National Resource Efficiency Policy provides an overarching collaborative framework for resource efficiency across all sectors in the country. That's all we had for you in this edition of Policy Watch. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Rajya Sabha Television.